For a team like the Tennessee Titans coming off of last year's playoff run where they won road playoff games against the New England Patriots, really for all intents and purposes being the final nail in the coffin in the Tom Brady experience in New England, and then going to Baltimore and beating the top-seeded Baltimore Ravens with their league MVP at quarterback Lamar Jackson, and then even in the AFC Championship game having a double-digit lead early against the eventual Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. Like, if you're the Titans, you're a Titans fan, you had a reason to have some expectations for this season. You had a reason to believe that this team could potentially do something. And two of the biggest questions that you had in the offseason was, what are you going to do with the contract situations for Ryan Tannehill and Derrick Henry? And they ended up re-signing both of them. They gave Tannehill a pretty decent contract. They gave Henry a big contract. And then on top of that, realizing that maybe they needed some more help in terms of their edge rushers and their pass rush in general, which should have been a warning sign for what could have happened this year. They brought in Jadeveon Clowney and Vic Beasley and kind of were hoping that these guys were going to inject some life into this defense. That didn't happen. But, if you're a Titans fan, you had to potentially feel pretty good about it. And then once you saw the 5-0 start, you got to be sitting there and saying, you know what? I believe in this team. I think they could do something. And they handled their business certainly in the division. They were 5-1. Their only loss being to the Colts, and there's no shame in that because the Colts themselves had Phillip Rivers and a top-flight defense. They were an 11-win team. Like, that's not a bad loss. So when it all came to pass, the Tennessee Titans, were 11-5 and divisional champions, which guaranteed them a home playoff game. And you're looking at this team and you're saying, okay, Derrick Henry's having a monster year. Tannehill's having a solid season. Their defense has stunk this year. Specifically, can't get any consistent edge pressure. But maybe they could get into the playoffs and figure it out and get that right stuff again like they did the previous year. And that didn't happen. They go in the wild card round and they lose at home to the Baltimore Ravens. So now if you're a Titans fan, you're like, all right, 2019 season, they slide in the back door, it almost feels like. And they go and they win multiple road playoff games, and they had a really good playoff run. This year, arguably better team, certainly, and they get bounced in the first round. It just goes to show, like, from one year to the next, so many things can change and so many things can be different in the NFL. It's really hard to know. But one thing you know when you're talking about the Titans is that Derrick Henry is their featured back. Derrick Henry is their dude. Derrick Henry is the guy. He's the straw that stirs the drink. He's the guy that makes everything go. He's the engine for that Titans offense. And he had a monster year. Like, I don't even think, excuse me. I don't even think people realize that he finished with over 2,000 rushing yards. Am I the only one that feels like we haven't given that any justice? That we have spent no time talking about that whatsoever? Like, it feels like it's something that should have really seriously put him in the MVP conversation, or at least gotten him a lot more attention than he got. And you might say, well, Derrick Henry gets a lot of attention. I agree with that, but when you think about 2,000-yard rushing season, especially in today's NFL, where teams run as little as they ever have, and you have so few teams that actually have a true featured lead back, especially as a ball carrier, for Derrick Henry to do this with other teams keying in on him, knowing that he's the number one option, knowing that he's the bell cow back, it was impressive stuff, especially coming off of a good season the previous year and that dominant playoff run and then getting the big contract. When you're thinking about it from a team standpoint of, do you really want to give a big contract to a running back? Then you see what Derrick Henry did and you don't feel so bad about it. A.J. Brown had another 1,000-yard receiving season. He's been everything you could hope for since they drafted him in the second round out of Ole Miss. Corey Davis didn't get his fifth-year option picked up before the season, but he had his best year, finished just shy of 1,000 yards receiving in 14 games. And Ryan Tannehill had a solid, if not spectacular season. He went under 4,000 yards passing, but it's a little bit more justifiable to do that when you've got Derrick Henry running for over 2,000 yards. He took care of the ball well, and they hit some big plays in the passing game. Tannehill had 33 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. For those of you that are going to say, well, you shit on this deal, them giving him all this money. And if you based it solely off the regular season, I deserve to be clowned. Absolutely. And how far did they make it in the playoffs? I'm just saying. And before you sit there and say that I'm a Ryan Tannehill hater, if you go way back in the day in that 2012 draft, like, you have your opinion about it all you want, then my number one quarterback in that draft was Ryan Tannehill. I'm just saying, like, you have to look at the reality of saying he had a really good season. Don't get me wrong. You shouldn't feel too terrible if you're a Titans fan that you gave him a ton of money. But is he that type of dude when the chips are on the line and you really need him? And to me, he's not, because if he was, you don't lose at home in the wild card round to the Baltimore Ravens, period. You just don't. Defensively, though, was the real problem. I could talk about Tannehill and this and that, but that's unfair. Because that defense took a total shit dive in 2020. They were bottom of the barrel in the league against the pass, bottom of the barrel of the league in total yards allowed. They only had 19 sacks on the season. Vic Beasley didn't even make it through the whole season with them. He was a bust. And then Jadeveon Clowney. Like, imagine thinking that Clowney's a great player. Like, people will still probably go back to his hit in the bowl game against against Michigan all those years back. The dude is average, especially as a pass rusher. Like, he just is not that dude, no matter how much people want to make him out to be. Good thing for the Titans is they didn't lock themselves up into a big long-term contract with him, because God knows they would instantly have regretted that decision. But when you're looking at it as a team like the Titans, you were hoping that Harold Landry would have some help, and it's going to come from guys like Clowney and Beasley, especially since you don't have Jarrell Casey anymore. You're looking at that defense, and you're expecting some type of pass rush to be generated, and it just didn't happen. In a 16-game season to have 19 sacks, that's pathetic. That is absolutely pathetic. And as a result, because they couldn't pressure anybody, it meant that quarterbacks had more time to throw, meaning that their secondary got ate alive, and they had 7 games where they gave up 30 or more points, which is a really interesting conflict when you're talking about a team that had a 2,000-yard rusher and a quarterback throw for 33 touchdowns and only 7 interceptions. Like, they needed every bit of that. And it speaks to just how terrible that defense was, that you had the Tennessee Titans with a 2,000-yard rusher, and they still had 7 games where they gave up 30 or more points on defense. That's terrible. So now you go into this offseason. You probably feel okay about what you got at quarterback. You know Derrick Henry's still your bell cow. But you have minimal cap space, and you got quite a few free agents: Jadeveon Clowney, Corey Davis, Daquan Jones, Gostkowski, Jonnu Smith, Desmond King. You know, are you going to be able to retain some of those guys, most of those guys, any of those guys? Are you even going to want to? You know, maybe Desmond King. You know, he was a guy that you brought in during the season and thought he played a decent role for him. Corey Davis. You know, how much do you really want to tie into him? Maybe you get Clowney back on another 1-year deal, although I would ask at this point in time, why the hell would you want him? It's just not that good. I mean, this is the dude. Like, this should speak to the stupidity of the Houston Texans. All those years after taking Mario Williams number 1 overall, they looked at Jadeveon Clowney in a draft class with Khalil Mack and especially Aaron Donald and said, Jadeveon Clowney is the guy that we want. Like, that should have been an indication of just how bad it was in Houston. I'm just saying. That's even before you get to the Bob era. Oh, God. But when you look at this team, you know, what do they need? In this case, in the offseason, it is defense, defense, defense. They got to find help in that front 7 specifically. They need to get a dynamic edge rusher opposite of Harold Landry. They need to get somebody on that defensive line that can work next to or opposite of Jeffrey Simmons. Like, they've got some pieces there on that defense in that front 7, but it ain't worked this past year. So they've got to get better. They could potentially use another inside linebacker to play opposite of Rashaan Evans. Like, corner could always use more depth. Like, this is a very, very heavy offseason for defensive focus for the Titans. It has to be. It needs to be. Because their defense fell off of a cliff in 2020. And they can't expect to be in the spot again of finishing that terribly as a defensive unit in 2021 and expect to be a double-digit win team and get a home playoff game, win in the division, etc. It's just not going to work out that way. And as much as offense matters in the league, and it absolutely does, it's the most important thing, you could get to a point where your offense is good enough. And I would say, while the Titans' offense is not outstanding, it is good enough that with a competent, even league average defense, they could be a real force. So therefore, they must invest heavily on the defensive side of the ball this offseason before they end up wasting what they've got. So good thing for this team is where they're going to be drafting, especially in round 1. Should be plenty of edge rushers available. They need some. I would potentially even double dip, because the double dip that you did in free agency sure as hell didn't work. So maybe double dipping in the draft potentially could. If they can address that defense and get it better, like maybe this Titans team's a bigger threat in 2021. But if they don't, their absolute ceiling is exactly what you saw out of them this year.